On a humid April morning in 1876, 3 workers hired to repair the crumbling foundation of a plantation house in rural Tennessee made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath the main floor, in a space that shouldn't have existed according to any building plans, they found 7 children, alive, pale as ghosts, speaking a language none of them recognized. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12. The youngest was perhaps 5. None of them had seen sunlight in years. The local authorities buried the official reports within weeks, and by summer, every newspaper in the county had stopped asking questions. Tonight, we're uncovering what really happened beneath the Harlow estate, and why the truth was sealed away for over a century. Before we continue with the story of the Harlow property and the children who lived in its shadows, I need you to do something for me. If you're fascinated by dark historical mysteries like this one, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your state or city in the comments below. I love knowing where our community of mystery lovers is listening from. Now, let's step back into the Tennessee countryside of 1876, where something unthinkable was about to be revealed. To understand what happened at the Harlow estate, you need to understand what Tennessee looked like in the spring of 1876. The Civil War had ended 11 years earlier, but the scars ran deeper than any battlefield wound. The Reconstruction era was coming to a bitter close. Federal troops were withdrawing from the South, and with them went any pretense of protecting the rights of freed slaves. White supremacist groups operated openly. Former plantation owners struggled to maintain their land without slave labor, and many estates fell into disrepair or changed hands entirely. Cumberland County, where our story takes place, was a patchwork of failing farms, abandoned properties, and small communities trying to rebuild. The county seat, Crossville, was little more than a courthouse and a handful of stores. Most people lived on scattered homesteads connected by rough dirt roads that became impassable rivers of mud after heavy rains. The Harlow estate sat approximately 6 miles southeast of Crossville, on a plot of land that had once been a modest tobacco plantation. The main house was a 2-story structure built in the late 1840s. Nothing grand like the columned mansions of the Delta, but solid enough, with thick oak beams and a stone foundation that had been dug deep to prevent settling. During the war, the property had changed hands twice, first seized by Union forces, then reclaimed by distant Harlow relatives after the surrender. By 1876, the house belonged to a man named Vernon Harlow, a Confederate veteran in his early 50s who had returned from the war missing 3 fingers on his left hand and carrying a persistent cough that never quite left him. Vernon had never married. He lived alone in the house with 2 hired men who worked the remaining acreage, trying to coax crops from soil exhausted by decades of tobacco cultivation. Vernon was known in Crossville as a quiet man who kept to himself. He made the trip to town once a month for supplies, paid his bills on time, and never caused trouble. People said the war had taken something from him, some essential spark that separated the living from the merely breathing. He attended church irregularly, sitting in the back pew and leaving before anyone could engage him in conversation. The minister, Reverend Godfrey Hayes, had tried several times to draw Vernon into the community, but the man remained polite and distant. The 2 hired men, Samuel Pitts and Jeremiah Cole, were former slaves who had stayed in the area after emancipation. Work was scarce, and Vernon paid them fairly, if not generously. They lived in a small cabin on the property, about 200 yards from the main house. Samuel was in his 30s, a strong man with a steady temperament. Jeremiah was older, perhaps 50, with gray threading through his hair and a limp from an old injury. Both men had learned to read despite the laws that had once forbidden it, and they attended the colored church in a settlement called Freeman's Ridge, about 8 miles north. Vernon rarely spoke to them beyond giving instructions for the day's work. They found this arrangement preferable to working for men who were more talkative but less fair with wages. The trouble began in early April, when Vernon noticed that the southeastern corner of the house was settling. The floor inside had developed a noticeable slope, and several floorboards had cracked under the strain. He examined the foundation from outside and saw that several stones had shifted, creating a gap. Water had likely gotten in during the winter, freezing and expanding, pushing the stones out of alignment. Vernon couldn't afford to let the problem worsen. A collapsing foundation could bring down an entire wall. He hired 3 additional workers from town, men who specialized in masonry and foundation repair. Their names were Thomas Yates, William Drury, and a young man named Elias Penn, barely 20 years old, working his first season in the construction trade. They arrived at the Harlow estate on the morning of April 14, 1876, bringing with them tools, wooden support beams, and several bags of mortar. The plan was simple: shore up the settling corner from beneath, replace the damaged stones, and reinforce the entire section. Vernon estimated the work would take 4 or 5 days. It took less than 3 hours for everything to change. The discovery. Thomas Yates had been repairing foundations for 15 years. He knew how a house should sit on the earth, how stones should stack, how support beams should bear weight. So when he crawled beneath the southeastern corner of the Harlow house and saw the wall, he knew immediately that something was wrong. The foundation extended inward much farther than it should. According to the dimensions of the house above, the space beneath should have been shallow, just enough clearance for ventilation and to prevent moisture from rotting the floor joists. But here, the space opened up. In the dim light filtering through the foundation gap, Thomas could see that the crawl space became a room. "William," he called out, his voice muffled, "bring the lantern." William Drury squeezed in beside him, holding up an oil lantern. The yellow light pushed back the darkness, and both men went very still. They were looking into a chamber, no, a corridor, that extended beneath the house. The walls were brick, laid with precision. The floor was packed earth hard as stone, and approximately 15 feet ahead, the corridor opened into what appeared to be a larger room. "What in God's name?" William whispered. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp earth. "This isn't on any building plan I've ever seen." "Mr. Harlow," William shouted, backing out of the crawl space quickly. "Mr. Harlow, you need to see this." Vernon came around the side of the house, walking with the careful gait of a man whose lungs didn't work quite right anymore. "What's the matter?" "There's a room under your house," Thomas said, emerging from beneath the foundation and brushing dirt from his shirt. "A built room with brick walls. Looks like it goes back a ways." Vernon's face, already pale, seemed to lose what little color it had. That's not possible. This house was built on a simple foundation. There's no cellar." "Well, there's something down there," William said, "and I'm not going in until we know what it is." Vernon stood very still for a long moment, staring at the gap in the foundation. Samuel and Jeremiah had stopped working in the field and were walking over, curious about the commotion. Young Elias Penn leaned against a fence post, watching. "Get me a lamp," Vernon finally said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "I'll go look. Might be snakes," Samuel warned, "or the whole thing could collapse if the walls ain't sound." Vernon didn't seem to hear him. He took the lantern from William and lowered himself to his hands and knees, crawling into the gap with the lamp held out in front of him. The other men waited. Thomas checked his pocket watch. 3 minutes passed, then 5. "Mr. Harlow," Thomas called. "You all right in there?" No response. "Maybe we should," William started to say. Then they heard it. A sound like nothing any of them had expected. A child's voice, high and thin, speaking words in what sounded like German, French. None of them could be certain, but it definitely wasn't English. Vernon emerged from beneath the house so quickly he banged his head on a support beam. He didn't seem to notice. His face was ashen, his eyes wide. The lantern shook in his hand. "There are children," he said, "living under my house. There are children down there." What followed was chaos of a slow, careful kind. The chaos of men trying to process the impossible, while still maintaining some grasp on rational action. Thomas insisted they get the sheriff immediately. William agreed, but Vernon stopped them with a raised hand, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority none of them had heard from him before. If we bring the sheriff now, those children will be terrified. We don't know who they are or how they got there, but they're alive, and they need help carefully. Samuel, Jeremiah, I need you to go in with me. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. You're less threatening, smaller built than these men. The children might trust you better. Samuel and Jeremiah exchanged a glance. There was something in Vernon's demeanor that troubled them both, but they nodded. Elias, Vernon continued, turning to the young man, ride to town. Find Dr. Marcus Webb. Tell him to come immediately and to bring whatever he'd need for treating children, malnourished children. Don't tell anyone else. Not yet. Sir, shouldn't we? Elias began. Go now, Vernon said firmly. Please. Elias mounted his horse and rode off at a gallop, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the morning air. Vernon, Samuel, and Jeremiah crawled beneath the house with 3 lanterns between them. Thomas and William waited above, listening to the muffled voices below. Vernon's low and steady, Jeremiah's gentle murmur, Samuel's occasional soft exclamation. It took nearly an hour. When the first child emerged, a girl, perhaps 10 years old, with matted dark hair and skin so pale it seemed translucent, William Drury took an involuntary step backward. She squinted in the daylight, raising one skeletal arm to shield her eyes. She wore a simple dress that might once have been gray, but was now the color of dirt. Her feet were bare, the soles calloused thick as leather. She spoke rapidly in that strange language, her voice urgent, questioning. Vernon emerged after her, holding her hand. His face was set in an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Horror, yes, but also something else. Sadness. Deep, profound sadness. There are 6 more, Vernon said quietly. Help me get them out, gently. They're frightened. One by one, the children came into the light. 2 boys and 5 girls, ranging in age from what appeared to be 5 years old to perhaps 12 or 13. They clung to each other, speaking in that incomprehensible tongue, their eyes huge and dark in their thin faces. Dr. Webb arrived just as the last child, a small boy with a twisted foot, was being lifted from beneath the house. The doctor, a man in his 60s with white mutton-chop whiskers, stopped his buggy and sat frozen for a long moment, staring at the scene before him. Dear God, he whispered, climbing down. What has happened here? I don't know, Vernon said, and there was such exhaustion in his voice that Thomas believed him. I truly don't know, Doctor. Webb examined the children right there in the yard, his hands gentle, his expression growing grimmer with each child. They were malnourished, certainly. Their muscles were underdeveloped, their joints swollen from nutritional deficiencies. Their skin bore the pallor of people who had never seen direct sunlight. They had sores in their mouths from scurvy. The oldest girl had lost several teeth. But they were alive. And that, Dr. Webb muttered, was a miracle in itself. They need immediate care, he told Vernon. Hospital care. And we need to notify the authorities. Where did these children come from? Vernon shook his head. I have no idea. I didn't know they were there. I swear to you, I didn't know. How is that possible? Thomas demanded. They're under your house. This house belonged to my uncle during the war, Vernon said, his voice shaking. He died in 64. I inherited it in 65 when I came back from Virginia. I've lived here 11 years and never knew there was anything beneath the floors. Someone put them there, Dr. Webb said quietly. Someone built that chamber and kept these children in it. The question is who and why. The children huddled together near the porch steps, and the oldest girl, her name they would later learn was Annalisa, spoke to them in low, urgent tones. She seemed to be trying to calm the younger ones, but her own fear was evident in every gesture. What language is that? William asked. German, Dr. Webb said, moving closer to listen. Or a dialect of it. Pennsylvania Dutch, perhaps. Or... He trailed off, frowning. Or what? Samuel asked. Or something older. There are German communities scattered through the South, settlers from before the Revolution. Some of them preserved old dialects that have changed little in generations. This sounds like that, but there's something else mixed in. French, maybe. Vernon went into the house and returned with blankets, bread, and a pitcher of water. The children fell on the bread like starving animals, tearing it apart with their hands, stuffing it into their mouths. Dr. Webb had to stop them gently, explaining through gestures that eating too quickly would make them sick. We need to go beneath the house, Thomas said. We need to see what's down there. Vernon nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose we do. With all the children safely above ground, Vernon led Thomas, William, Samuel, Jeremiah, and Dr. Webb into the hidden space beneath the house. They moved in single file through the narrow corridor, their lanterns casting jerking shadows on the brick walls. The corridor opened into a room approximately 20 feet long and 15 feet wide. The ceiling was just high enough for a man to stand if he hunched slightly. The walls were brick, laid with such precision that barely any mortar showed between them. Someone had built this space with great care, great secrecy, and great purpose. The room was furnished, if that word could be used. There were 7 rough straw mattresses arranged along one wall, covered with threadbare blankets. A few wooden crates served as tables and storage. On these crates sat metal plates, cups, and a few crude wooden toys. A doll with a fabric face, a top, some carved animals. In one corner stood a covered bucket, the smell from which made William gag and turn away. The air was thick, musty, with a smell of unwashed bodies and damp earth. But what struck Thomas most was how organized everything was. This wasn't a prison exactly, or rather it was a prison, but one where someone had tried to make the captivity bearable. On one wall, someone had used charcoal to draw pictures. Simple figures, people, houses, trees, a sun. The sun was drawn over and over again, in different sizes, with rays extending in all directions. They drew what they remembered, Dr. Webb said softly, studying the pictures, or what they'd been told about. Look, that's a church steeple. And that's a wagon. There were books too, 3 of them so worn and handled that their covers were falling apart. Dr. Webb picked one up carefully, squinting at the text in the lamplight. German, he confirmed. Children's Bible stories, and this one, it's a primer for teaching reading. Someone was educating them, Samuel said, his voice tight with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Or keeping them docile, Jeremiah added grimly. Thomas found a wooden panel in one corner that, when pulled aside, revealed a narrow shaft leading upward. He held his lantern into it and could see where it opened, directly into the floor of what he realized must be the pantry above. This is how they were fed, he said. Someone could lower food and water from above without ever coming down here. Vernon stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, taking it all in. His face was unreadable. Mr. Harlow, Dr. Webb said carefully, I must ask you directly. Did you know about this place? No, Vernon said. I swear to God I did not. But someone did, Thomas said. Someone built this, maintained it, fed those children, for years, by the look of them. Who lived in this house before you? Vernon closed his eyes. My uncle, Benjamin Harlow. He owned this property from 1847 until his death in September of 1864. He was killed at the Battle of Fisher's Hill in Virginia. I was there when it happened. Was he married? Dr. Webb asked. No. He lived alone. He had a housekeeper, a free-colored woman named Ruth. She left when the Union Army came through in '63. I don't know where she went. Anyone else? He had workers, of course, slaves before the war, hired men after, but none of them lived in the main house. Samuel crouched down beside one of the mattresses, examining it closely. These are old, he said. The straws compressed down to almost nothing. These been here a long time. So the children have been here since before Mr. Benjamin died. Jeremiah reasoned. That's at least 12 years. Maybe longer. The oldest girl doesn't look more than 13, Dr. Webb said slowly. If she's been here 12 years, she was brought here as an infant. They all were. The implications of this settled over the men like a suffocating blanket. We need to contact the authorities, Dr. Webb said firmly. The sheriff, at minimum. And we need to get those children proper care immediately. I can take 3 of them in my buggy. Someone will need to arrange transport for the others. What will the authorities do? Vernon asked quietly. Investigate, Dr. Webb said. Try to find out who these children are, where they came from, who put them here. Try to reunite them with their families if such families exist. And if they don't exist? Dr. Webb had no answer for that. They emerged from beneath the house to find that the children had moved closer together, forming a tight cluster on the porch steps. The oldest girl, Annalisa, held the smallest boy, the one with the twisted foot, in her lap, rocking him gently. She watched the men with fierce, protective eyes. They think we're going to separate them, Dr. Webb said softly. We need to be very careful. Just then the sound of hoofbeats announced the arrival of Sheriff Marcus Trent, accompanied by his deputy, a young man named Owen Clark. Elias Penn must have told someone in town, and word had spread quickly, as it always did in small communities. Sheriff Trent was a heavy-set man with a thick mustache and eyes that had seen too much during the war and the hard years that followed. He dismounted slowly, staring at the children with an expression of complete bewilderment. What in the name of... He trailed off, shaking his head. Dr. Webb, what's happened here? Dr. Webb explained the situation as clearly as he could. The foundation repair, the discovery of the hidden chamber, the children who had been living beneath Vernon Harlow's house for God only knew how long. Sheriff Trent listened in silence, his face growing darker with each detail. When Dr. Webb finished, the sheriff turned to Vernon. Mr. Harlow, I'm going to need you to come with me. We have questions. I understand, Vernon said quietly. But I've told you everything I know. I didn't know they were there. Then how did they survive? Sheriff Trent demanded. Food doesn't appear by magic. Someone fed them. Someone brought them water. I don't know, Vernon repeated, but there was something in his voice, a slight catch, a hesitation, that made Thomas wonder if that was entirely true. If you're enjoying this dark mystery and want to hear more stories like this, hit that like button and share this video with a friend who loves unsolved historical cases. What theory do you have about these children? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Let's discover together what happened next in Cumberland County. Sheriff Trent's investigation began immediately, and it would consume the next 3 weeks of his life. He was a methodical man, and he approached the Harlow case with the same thorough attention he'd given to everything else in his career. But from the very beginning he encountered walls, some visible, some invisible, but all equally impenetrable. The children were taken to the home of Mrs. Eleanor Pruitt, a widow who ran a small boarding house in Crossville. Mrs. Pruitt was known for her kindness and her discretion, and Dr. Webb trusted her to care for the children while the investigation proceeded. She set them up in 2 large rooms on the 2nd floor, gave them real beds with clean sheets, fed them carefully to avoid overwhelming their damaged systems, and tried, as best she could, to communicate with them. The language barrier proved significant. The oldest girl, Annalisa, spoke a form of German that Dr. Webb recognized as similar to Pennsylvania Dutch, but with archaic elements he couldn't quite place. None of the children spoke English. They didn't seem to understand it either, though after a few days, some of the younger ones began picking up basic words. Annalise was protective of the others to a fierce degree. She wouldn't let anyone examine them without her approval. She insisted on tasting any food before allowing the younger children to eat it. At night, Mrs. Pruitt reported, Annalisa would walk from bed to bed, checking on each child, making sure they were breathing, comforting those who cried out in their sleep. Dr. Webb spent hours trying to gain Annaliese's trust. He brought sweets, which the children had apparently never tasted. Their wonder at sugar was heartbreaking to witness. He brought picture books and showed them illustrations of the outside world. He spoke gently, moved slowly, never raised his voice. Finally, after 5 days, Anneliese began to talk. What she told Dr. Webb communicated through a combination of her limited German, his limited understanding, and much drawing of pictures, was fragmentary and confusing. But certain things became clear. She remembered being taken down into the darkness when she was very young. She didn't remember a time before the chamber, though she had vague, dreamlike memories of light and open space. A woman had cared for them. Anneliese called her Tante, which meant aunt. This woman had fed them, taught them to read from the German Bible, told them stories, sang them songs. "Where is this woman now?" Dr. Webb asked, and Anneliese's face closed like a door slamming shut. She wouldn't answer, wouldn't draw, wouldn't even look at him. He tried different approaches. "Is she dead?" Anneliese shook her head. "Is she alive?" A small nod. "Do you know where she is?" Anneliese looked at him with ancient, wounded eyes and said something in German that he couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough. "I will not tell you." The younger children knew even less. The two smallest, a girl of perhaps 5 and the boy with the twisted foot, who appeared to be 6, had never been above ground until the day they were found. They were terrified of the sky, of wind, of birdsong. The first time it rained, they huddled together in a corner and wouldn't be comforted for hours. Meanwhile, Sheriff Trent pursued other lines of investigation. He brought in a builder from Knoxville to examine the hidden chamber and provide an expert opinion on when it was constructed. The builder, a man named Harrison Church, spent a full day beneath the Harlow house, measuring, examining the brickwork, testing the mortar. His conclusion: the chamber had been built sometime in the late 1840s or early 1850s, around the same time as the house itself. It was original to the structure, not added later. The brickwork matched the chimney and the foundation walls. Whoever designed this house had designed it with the hidden chamber included. This was planned from the beginning, Church told Sheriff Trent. This wasn't some hasty hiding place. Someone built this house specifically to have this space beneath it. Vernon Harlow's uncle Benjamin had commissioned the construction of the house in 1847. He had brought in workers from Knoxville for the job, paid them well, and then sent them away. Local men had done some of the finish work, but the foundation, the frame, the core structure, all of that had been done by outsiders who left when the job was complete. Sheriff Trent tried to track down the construction workers, but most of them were dead or impossible to locate. One man, now in his 70s and living in Memphis, remembered the job, but couldn't recall anything unusual about it. "Mr. Harlow was particular about the foundation," the old man said. "Wanted it deep and strong. We dug out more earth than usual, I remember that. But he paid extra, so we didn't question it." The sheriff interviewed everyone who had known Benjamin Harlow. The picture that emerged was of a solitary man, religious but not fanatical, reserved in his dealings with others. He had never married, which some found odd, but not inexplicable. He had fought in the Mexican War in the late 1840s and came back changed, people said. Quieter, more withdrawn. Did he have any children? Sheriff Trent asked. No one knew of any. If he had fathered children with slaves on his property, it would hardly have been unusual for the time. But there were no records, no rumors, no whispers. What about the housekeeper, Ruth? The sheriff asked. The colored woman who worked for him? Several people remembered Ruth, though no one knew her last name. She had been a free woman of color, unusual in those days. She had kept to herself, had been loyal to Benjamin Harlow, and had disappeared when Union forces came through in 1863. One woman remembered that Ruth spoke German. German? Sheriff Trent said sharply. Are you certain? Yes, sir. I heard her myself once, singing to herself in the market. German, clear as day. I asked her about it, and she said she'd been raised by a German family in Pennsylvania. This was the first real connection. A German-speaking housekeeper in a house where German-speaking children had been hidden. Sheriff Trent felt he was getting closer to something. But Ruth had vanished more than 13 years ago. Finding her seemed impossible. Then, 3 weeks after the discovery, a man came forward. His name was Josiah Clark, and he was a freedman who had worked on the Harlow property as a slave before the war. He was in his 50s now, living on a small farm he'd managed to purchase 10 miles north of Crossville. He came to the sheriff's office on a Monday morning, hat in his hands, clearly nervous. "I heard about the children," he said. "I think I know something about it. But I need your word that what I tell you won't be used against me or my family." Sheriff Trent considered this carefully. "I can't make promises until I know what you're going to tell me," he said. "But if you've done nothing criminal, you have nothing to fear." Josiah nodded slowly. "All right, I'll tell you what I know. Back in 49 or 50, I can't remember exactly, Mr. Benjamin went away for about 3 months. He said he was going to Pennsylvania on business. When he came back, he brought Ruth with him. She was a free woman, like I said. But there was something. He was protecting her from something, or someone. He built that house, and Ruth lived there with him, but not as his woman, if you understand me. More like she was hiding. Hiding from what? I don't know. But she was afraid. I saw it in her eyes. And sometimes, late at night, I'd see lamplight in that house, and I'd hear singing. Children's songs, in German. I thought maybe Ruth was singing to herself. Or maybe Mr. Benjamin had children somewhere that no one talked about. But I never saw any children. Not once in all those years. Did you ever go inside the main house? No, sir. Mr. Benjamin didn't allow it. He and Ruth kept that house to themselves. What happened when the Union Army came through? Ruth left. Just disappeared one night, Mr. Benjamin was away fighting by then. He'd gone to join the army in 62. The house sat empty for almost 2 years. Then Mr. Vernon came back after the war and took over the property. Far as I know, he lived there alone all this time. Did Vernon know about the children? Josiah was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, sir. I truly don't. But I'll tell you this. About a year ago, maybe a little more, I saw someone leaving the Harlow property late at night. A woman, dressed in dark clothes, walking fast down the road toward town. I only saw her for a moment in the moonlight, but she looked like Ruth. Older, but the same woman. Sheriff Trent leaned forward. Did you speak to her? No, sir. By the time I thought to call out, she was gone, and I wasn't sure it was really her. Could have been my eyes playing tricks. Did you tell anyone about this? No, sir. Wasn't my business. But now, with these children, I thought you should know. After Josiah left, Sheriff Trent sat in his office and tried to piece together a theory that made sense. A hidden chamber built in 1847. A German-speaking housekeeper who arrived in 1849 or 1850 and disappeared in 1863. 7 children who spoke German and had been living in that chamber for possibly their entire lives. A woman who might or might not be Ruth, seen near the property a year ago. It wasn't enough. There were too many gaps, too many questions. Where had the children come from? Who were their parents? If Ruth had been caring for them, why? And if Ruth had left in 1863, who had been feeding them for the past 13 years? The only person who might have those answers was Vernon Harlow himself. Vernon had remained in his house throughout the investigation, cooperative but distant. He answered every question put to him, allowed the sheriff to search the property thoroughly, provided any documentation requested. But there was a wall around him that no one could quite breach. A sense that he was holding something back, not out of malice, but out of some deep, complicated sense of duty or protection. On the evening of May 7th, 1876, 3 weeks and 4 days after the children were found, Sheriff Trent rode out to the Harlow estate alone. He arrived as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the dark business at hand. Vernon was sitting on the porch, smoking a pipe. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past month. His face was gaunt, his eyes shadowed. "Sheriff," he said without surprise, "I've been expecting you. May I sit? Please." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the evening sounds. Crickets, a distant owl, the rustle of new leaves in the trees. "I need the truth, Vernon," Sheriff Trent said finally. "All of it. Those children deserve that much." Vernon drew on his pipe, exhaled slowly. "Yes," he said, "they do." "Did you know they were there?" "Not at first," Vernon said. "When I came back from the war and took over this property, I truly didn't know. My uncle had never mentioned it. There was nothing in his papers. I lived here for almost 10 years, completely unaware." "What changed?" "I found a letter," Vernon said softly. "It was in a Bible that had belonged to my uncle, a German Bible that I couldn't read. I took it to a man in Crossville who knew German, asked him to translate it for me. The letter was from Ruth. It was dated 1862, written to my uncle while he was away at war. In it, she told him that the children were well, that she was caring for them as she always had, but that she was afraid. Union soldiers were in the area, and she worried what might happen if they searched the house. She asked my uncle for guidance." "What did the letter say about the children? Where they came from?" "It didn't," Vernon said. "It only referred to them as the blessed ones and spoke about keeping them safe. But it made clear that she and my uncle had been protecting these children for a long time, and that it was a sacred duty." "When did you find this letter?" Vernon closed his eyes. "June of 1867. 2 years after I moved into this house. I confronted Ruth about it." "Ruth? She was here?" "She came back," Vernon said. "After the war ended, after things settled down, she came back. She knocked on my door one night and begged me to let her care for the children again. That's when I learned they existed. She told me everything." Sheriff Trent felt his heart racing. "Where is Ruth now?" "Dead," Vernon said flatly. "She died 2 years ago. Pneumonia. She's buried in Freeman's Ridge, in the colored cemetery. Unmarked grave. Tell me what she told you." Vernon took a long moment before speaking. When he did, his voice was low and steady, the voice of a man who had been carrying a terrible burden and was finally setting it down. "In 1849, my Uncle Benjamin went to Pennsylvania. He was involved with a religious community there. Not a church exactly, but a group of believers who practiced what they believed was a purer, older form of worship. They called themselves the Preserved Brethren. Ruth was part of that community. She was young then, maybe 20 years old, and she was devoted to their beliefs." "What beliefs?" "They believed the world was ending," Vernon said, "that the apocalypse would come within their generation. They believed that God had commanded them to preserve a remnant, pure souls who would be kept separate from the corruption of the world, hidden away, educated in the old ways, so that when the end came, they would emerge to rebuild." Sheriff Trent felt cold despite the warm evening. "The children," he said. "They were the remnant." Vernon nodded. 7 children from families in the community, infants or toddlers when they were given really. The parents believed they were doing God's work. They believed their children would be saved while the world burned. My uncle was chosen as the keeper because he had the means and the isolation. He built the chamber, and Ruth came to Tennessee to care for the children, to educate them, to preserve them. "For how long?" "Forever, if necessary," Vernon said. "Or until the end times came, whichever happened first." The horror of it settled over Sheriff Trent like a crushing weight. These parents gave away their children to be locked in a hole in the ground. "They believed it was salvation," Vernon said. "They believed the alternative was worse, that their children would be corrupted by the world, damned for eternity. This way, the children would be pure, uncorrupted, ready for the kingdom to come." "And your uncle believed this too?" "He did," Vernon said. "He truly did." Until the war. He wrote letters to Ruth. I found them after she died. In the later letters, he started to express doubts. He wondered if they had made a mistake. But by then, it was too late. The children had been in the chamber for years. They knew nothing else. And Ruth was still utterly convinced they were doing God's will. What happened when you found out? I wanted to release them immediately, Vernon said. I wanted to bring them out, give them real lives. But Ruth begged me not to. She said it would destroy them, that they'd been raised for a specific purpose, that the outside world would be cruel and incomprehensible to them. She convinced me that the kindest thing was to let them continue as they were, at least until they were older, until they could be gradually introduced to the outside world. So you kept them there, Sheriff Trent said, and he couldn't keep the judgment from his voice. Yes, Vernon said. God help me, yes. Ruth continued to care for them. I provided the money for food and supplies. I told myself I was protecting them, that I was doing the right thing. But the truth is, I was a coward. I was afraid of the scandal, afraid of what it would mean if people found out. So I let Ruth continue, and I pretended it wasn't happening. For 9 years. For 9 years, Vernon agreed. His voice broke slightly. And then Ruth died, and I was alone with the secret. I should have freed them then, but I didn't. I kept feeding them, lowering food through the shaft twice a day. I kept them alive, and I kept them hidden. I told myself I would figure out what to do, but I never did. And then the foundation started to settle, and I had to call in workers, and he spread his hands helplessly. Here we are. Those children lost their entire lives, Sheriff Trent said. They lost childhoods, families, freedom, because of your uncle's delusions and your cowardice. Yes, Vernon said simply. I know. There will be consequences. I know that too. They sat in silence as full dark fell around them. Sheriff Trent knew he should arrest Vernon immediately, but some part of him understood that this man was as much a victim as a perpetrator, a victim of his uncle's fanaticism, of his own weakness, of a terrible situation with no good solutions. What about the parents? Sheriff Trent asked finally. The families who gave these children away? Dead, most likely, Vernon said, or scattered. The preserved brethren fell apart in the 1850s. Some of them died in a cholera epidemic. Others lost faith when the apocalypse didn't come as predicted. Ruth told me that by the time the war started, there was no one left who even remembered the children. No one to reclaim them. So they're orphans. In every sense. The oldest girl, Annalise, she wouldn't tell us where Ruth was. She was protecting you, wasn't she? Vernon nodded. Ruth told the children that there were bad people in the outside world who would hurt them if they were found. She told them that they had to keep the secret, had to stay hidden, or terrible things would happen. Annalisa believed her. They all did. They loved Ruth. Yes, Vernon said. She was the only mother they ever knew. She cared for them, in her way. She was kind to them, and she genuinely believed she was saving their souls. Sheriff Trent stood up slowly, feeling every one of his 48 years. You'll need to come with me, Vernon. There will be charges. What those charges will be exactly, I don't know. This is beyond anything I've dealt with before. I understand, Vernon said. He stood as well, knocked out his pipe, and set it carefully on the porch railing. May I ask you something, Sheriff? Go ahead. What will happen to the children? I don't know, Sheriff Trent admitted. Dr. Webb thinks they can be taught, can adapt. They're young enough, but it will take time and patience and care. I suppose they'll be placed with families eventually, if we can find families willing to take them. Will you tell them the truth? About where they came from, why they were hidden? I don't know, Sheriff Trent said again. Maybe, when they're old enough to understand, if they want to know. They deserve better than what they were given, Vernon said. They deserve everything they lost. Yes, Sheriff Trent agreed. They do. The story of the children found beneath the Harlow house should have been a sensation. It should have spread across Tennessee, across the South, across the nation. 7 children, hidden their entire lives, living beneath a house in Cumberland County. But it didn't spread. The story stayed local, contained. Why? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to this. In 1876, Tennessee was trying desperately to move forward. The war was over. Reconstruction was ending. The federal troops were leaving. White Southerners were reclaiming power through violence and intimidation, and the last thing anyone wanted was a story that painted them as cruel, fanatical, or insane. The Harlow case made people uncomfortable. It raised questions no one wanted to answer about religion, about family, about what people were capable of when they believed they were acting in God's name. It also implicated a Confederate veteran. Benjamin Harlow had died fighting for the South, and no one wanted to tarnish the memory of fallen soldiers. So the story was quietly suppressed. The local newspapers ran brief mentions. "Children found in unusual circumstances" was one headline, but none of them went into detail. When reporters from larger cities came asking questions, they were politely stonewalled. Records were lost or misfiled. Key witnesses suddenly became unavailable or couldn't remember details. By summer of 1876, the story had effectively disappeared. Vernon Harlow was charged with unlawful imprisonment and child endangerment. But the trial, held in September of that year, was brief and attracted little attention. Vernon pled guilty to all charges and threw himself on the mercy of the court. His lawyer argued that Vernon had been placed in an impossible situation, that he had provided for the children's basic needs, and that he had been trying to protect them from a world that would not understand. The judge, a man named Albert Stern, who had also fought for the Confederacy, sentenced Vernon to 3 years in prison, but immediately suspended the sentence, citing Vernon's service to the South and his cooperation with authorities. Vernon walked out of the courtroom a free man, though few would call him that. He returned to his property, sold it within a month, and disappeared from public record. Some say he moved west, others claimed he drank himself to death. No one knows for certain. The children remained in Mrs. Pruitt's care through the summer and fall of 1876. Dr. Webb worked with them daily, teaching them English, introducing them slowly to the outside world. It was slow, difficult work. The children were traumatized in ways that hadn't even been named yet. They had nightmares. They refused to sleep in rooms with the doors closed. They hoarded food, afraid it would be taken away. They flinched at sudden movements and loud noises, but they were also resilient in ways that surprised everyone. They learned quickly. They absorbed English like thirsty ground absorbing rain. They discovered food they'd never tasted, experienced weather, played in grass, felt wind on their faces for the first time with awareness. Annalisa, the oldest, proved particularly adaptive. She had a fierce intelligence and a determination to understand this new world she'd been thrust into. By December of 1876, arrangements had been made. 3 of the children, the 2 youngest and one of the middle children, a girl named Margaret, were adopted by families in the area. Dr. Webb personally vouched for the families, made sure they understood the children's special needs, and checked on them regularly. The other 4 children, including Annalisa, were sent to an orphanage in Knoxville. It wasn't ideal, but it was clean, well run, and the matron was a kind woman who had been briefed on their situation. Dr. Webb visited them there once a month for the next 3 years. What happened to them after that is mostly lost to history. Records from that era are incomplete, especially for orphanages and adoptions. But there are fragments, clues. A marriage record from 1885 in Knox County shows an Anna Harlow marrying a carpenter named James Vick. Anna was listed as being born in Pennsylvania. If this was Annalise, and the timing fits, she would have been about 22 years old. She had taken the surname Harlow, perhaps in memory of the only life she'd known, or perhaps because she had no other name to claim. A census record from 1890 shows a family named Vick living in Knoxville. James, age 35, Anna, age 27, and 3 children. The address listed is a respectable neighborhood. James is listed as a master carpenter, which suggests the family was doing well financially. If this was Annalisa, she survived. She made a life. She had children who were born into sunlight and freedom. The others, the 6 younger children, are harder to trace. Their names were changed, either through adoption or simply through the passage of time and the desire to escape their past. They scattered into the anonymity that most people occupy, their story known only to themselves and perhaps to the families who raised them. The Harlow property sat empty for several years after Vernon sold it. Eventually it was purchased by a farmer who tore down the main house and built a new one on a different part of the land. If the new owner knew about the chamber beneath the old foundation, he never spoke of it. The bricks were probably reused, the space filled in with earth. All physical evidence of what had existed there slowly disappeared. But in Cumberland County, among the older residents, the memory persisted. It became one of those local stories that was whispered about but never discussed openly. The story of the children who lived beneath the Harlow house. The story of the woman who kept them there out of misguided faith. The story of the man who inherited a terrible secret and didn't have the courage to set it right. People passed by the property and wondered. Children dared each other to walk through the fields where the old house had stood. There were rumors, of course, rumors that grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said the children had been demons, others said they'd been angels. Some claimed they'd been the product of incest or forbidden experiments. None of these were true, but the truth was somehow more disturbing than any legend could be. The truth was simply this: 7 children lost their lives to someone else's vision of salvation. They lost their childhoods, their families, their chance at normal lives because adults who claimed to love them believed that hiding them in darkness was preferable to letting them live in light. And when the truth finally came out, when the children were finally freed, the world didn't want to hear about it. The story was too uncomfortable, too damning. So it was buried almost as effectively as the children themselves had been buried, not in earth, but in silence. There's a small historical marker now, just off Route 127, about 6 miles southeast of Crossville. It was placed there in 2003 by a local historical society. The text is brief. Near this site stood the Harlow estate, where in 1876, 7 children were discovered living in a hidden chamber beneath the main house. The children, who had been kept isolated from birth as part of a religious sect's beliefs about the end times, were rescued and integrated into Tennessee society. This incident remains one of the most unusual cases of child endangerment in state history. The marker doesn't tell the whole story. It doesn't mention Vernon's paralysis in the face of an impossible decision. It doesn't mention Ruth's absolute certainty that she was doing God's work. It doesn't mention the parents who gave their children away. It doesn't mention how the story was suppressed or how uncomfortable it made people to confront what had happened. But it's there. A small acknowledgement that something terrible occurred in this place and that it shouldn't be forgotten. Sometimes people stop to read the marker. Sometimes they take pictures. Sometimes they drive away without really absorbing what they've read because the story is too strange, too disturbing to fully process. But for those who take the time to dig deeper, to search through old newspapers, to read Dr. Webb's notes, preserved in a local historical archive, to piece together the fragments of this story, the truth is there, waiting. 7 children spent their entire young lives in darkness because adults believed darkness was safer than light. And when they were finally brought into the sun, they discovered a world that didn't want to look at them too closely, didn't want to acknowledge what had been done to them, didn't want to face the uncomfortable questions their existence raised. This happened in 1876 in Tennessee, not as a ghost story, not as a legend, but as a documented fact. The children were real, their suffering was real, and the silence that followed their discovery was as real as the darkness they were kept in. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or are there still secrets hidden in the foundation of the Harlow estate? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more historical mysteries like this, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves dark history. There are more stories waiting to be uncovered, and I'll be here to tell them. See you in the next video.